Siberia is a word that conjures up a number of stereotypical and often negative images in the minds of most people. Its environment is perpetual winter, sub-zero temperatures, and blinding blizzards. Its historical significance is equally notorious as a place of banishment, exile, forced labor, and imprisonment. A prison for the victims of Russian authoritarianism. Siberia has become a byword for extremes of cold, incarceration, and sheer human suffering. Paradoxically, for many, it has instead been a land of freedom, a wild frontier to explore and carve out, a place where the grip of Moscow was felt weaker than in the heartland. The relations between the European-based core of the Russian Empire and its North Asian province of Siberia, the peripheral yet fabulously profitable possessions over the Urals, have been characterized by a continuing conflict between the Kremlin on the one hand and the increasingly resentful inhabitants, both native and immigrant, of the continent beyond the Urals. Indeed, the very term beyond the Urals used to describe Siberia denotes an obviously Eurocentric view of the region. Over the centuries since the original Russian conquest and subsequent colonization of the territory, the Siberian aborigines, or Siberiaki, including both the original aborigines of Siberia and their Slavic incomers, who later became known as the Starozhili, or Old Inhabitants, gradually developed a sense of their own specific regional identity and nationality, and their own interests that challenged those of Muscovite and Imperial Russia. The conquest of Siberia by the Empire was a remarkable historical feat. In just 30 years, from 1610 to 1640, Russian frontiers advanced 5,000 kilometers from the Ob River to the Pacific Ocean. What began in the Muscovite period as expeditions to enlarge the state's borders and acquire furs, spearheaded by the Cossacks, adventurers, and refugees fleeing religious and social oppression in the West, during the twilight of Imperial Russia became a strategic bridge to Asia, developed by convict labor, populated by contract seasonal workers and resettled peasants. At the end of the 17th century, the population of Siberia was below 500,000. But only in 1897, 7 years after the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, it reached 5 million. And in 1911, it had already shot up to 8.4 million, of which only around 900,000 were from indigenous ethnicities. Sona area in Siberia rose by 122% in the 20 years before the Russian Revolution, with 3/4 of the annual harvest heading into the Western Russian market. Population in the larger towns, such as Tomsk, Irkutsk, Omsk, Vladivostok, Chita, and Novonikolaevsk, now called Novosibirsk, grew by between 100 to 800% in the same 20-year period. From 1909 to 1914, so 5 years, 4 million peasants resettled to Siberia. This was possible because of the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and it was encouraged by the policies of Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, which you already mentioned. The railroad both connected this massive territory with the heartland and allowed the Tsars and their ministers to squander huge sums in their quest for East Asia. The blessing of Siberia's mineral wealth was combined with the curse of the costs required to develop infrastructure, just as the conquest of the massive region both provided security from the empire's western threats and made Russia come into contact with new ones in the east. In the end, the eagle flew too close to the rising sun, and in 1905 it came away finally singed. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway had threatened to shift the balance of power in East Asia permanently in the favor of Russia, which made war with the rising power of Japan inevitable. All the flammable social material built up by decades of draconian autocracy was ignited by the empire's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, a war of overextension, a war of greed over yet another territorial acquisition in the Far East, this time Manchuria. While it managed to survive the 1905 revolution, the empire was an irreversible downward spiral, and the twin revolutions of 1917 only finished the job that was started in 1905 after yet another war broke out, this time the Great War. With the rise of Soviet Russia came the third discovery of Siberia. Soviet Siberia retained some of the fundamental characteristics of the imperial colony, but doubled down on the promise of a better life for all. The discovery of oil and natural gas, along with state investments in industrial and scientific development, made the region attractive to young workers, as did the state incentives in the form of increased wages and other perks that, for the most part, continue to this day. Before the revolution, Siberia accounted for only around 1% of the country's total production, but that number reached 7.5% after the substantial economic development of the Soviet period. In our timeline, in 1961, the population was around 18 million, but in the New Order, due to there being many more incentives, we call them, for migration from the occupied West, the population is actually closer to 22 million. However, as can be expected, the shattering of the USSR has plunged the region into chaos and instability. The size and the relatively sparse population, especially density, make the territory a prime habitat for warlordism, as has been proven during the Russian Civil War by men such as the Cossack Ataman Grigory Semyonov, the Bloody Baron Ungern von Sternberg, and Admiral Kolchak. The region's many ethnic and regional groups are also represented. To the west are the ambitious West Russian warlords who seek to reunite the motherland. To the south is the powder keg of Central Asia, and to the east, Japan and its not-so-loyal Chinese puppets look north for living space. The stage is set for a bloody battle for Siberia. The first group that we're going to take a look into is just east of the Urals, way to the north, the Free Aviators. Now, the Free of Charge Aviators are a group of female Soviet pilots based in Azovsky, in the far north, formed from the Night Witches Regiment of the Great Patriotic War fame, led by Yevdokia Virshanskaya. During the Second World War, this regiment was a women's-only ground attack and night fighting unit, and used outdated biplanes to stealthily harass the German forces. For their effectiveness, they were actually nicknamed the Night Witches by German troops and received a Guards designation by the Soviet military. In the TNO timeline, they have taken up the mantle of the protectors of Russian skies from the incessant German air attacks that are coming from the Luftwaffe. While their effectiveness and resources at their disposal are pretty much unknown, their actions are considered so heroic that all anti-German Russian factions are friendly towards them. Even Omsk will go far to rescue and shelter a downed aviator. It is likely that because of this and their ideology, they will probably join any anti-German coalition headed by pretty much anyone except maybe far-right states. Next up, we have Tyumen. Tyumen used to be one of the centers of the Sibir Khanate, a Mongol successor state that occupied the area today known as Western Siberia. As you can probably guess, the Khanate's name was later given to a much wider region, modern Siberia. The Khanate was the last serious obstacle to Russia's eastward expansion, and after its destruction, Tyumen was refounded as a Russian city, and coasted along as a minor economic center until the discovery of oil in the 1960s. The city in TNO used to be the capital of a USSR successor state led by Stalinist man Lazar Kaganovich. However, the People's Republic of Western Siberia, as it was known, collapsed on itself and is now composed of free states, free independent ones. Sverdlovsk, under the Red Army, and Konstantin Rokossovsky, the ultranationalist Omsk, and Tyumen itself, a seat of Kaganovich's remnant government. While they are directly a successor to the USSR and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Kaganovich's government doesn't continue the policies of the TNO timeline General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Nikolai Bukharin, but instead they would like to support more Stalinist policies. Kaganovich can either continue down his harsh authoritarian path and search for Stalin in the West, or be stopped by his brother, Mikhail Kaganovich, who wishes to reform the state to be less authoritarian. He is supposedly a Libertarian Socialist, and improve relations with the surrounding warlords. We do not know whether Stalin can actually be found. However, Tyumen may also have the body of another Soviet leader, Lenin, as in real life, the city was the place where they transported the body from Moscow in case the city fell to the Germans during the time of the Second World War. So yeah, that could be a thing too. Just to the east of Tyumen, we have Omsk. Omsk is despair. It is an ultranationalist militant warlord state led by the revenge-mongering Black League, or Chornaya Liga, whose only objective is to achieve revenge upon all those who have wronged the motherland. They will embark on a desperate and bloody crusade, conscripting every man, woman, and child into the army if necessary, and send them into human wave attacks, sometimes armed only with shovels. The endgame of Omsk is the war for the final extermination of Germany for what she has done to the Russian people. The Black League will stop at nothing, even the threat of nuclear apocalypse, in their quest to enact bitter revenge upon the Germans. While Omsk is pretty much a wild and outlandish creation of a twisted timeline, not only is an ultranationalist Russian state nothing too unheard of, there have been many dangers of that in history, the city is also somewhat known on both the English and Russian internet as kind of a sad and disparaging place, so that's where that's from. East of Omsk, we have another Omsk, but with a T in the front. So we're going to take a look. Tomsk, as a city, is mostly an average center in Siberia that has become the base of an attempt to revive the short-lived Russian Republic of 1917. The state was formed by various intellectuals, dissidents, and some remnants of the White movement in the Civil War that regrouped after the fall of the USSR. The leader of the state is the famous Russian writer Boris Pasternak, who leads the conservative Russian Production Party. We can see over here, Rossiyskaya Pромышленная партия. Tomsk is one of the contenders for the reunification of Russia, and will be the go-to pick for anyone that wants to play a Russian republic. The fact that the old members of the White movement are participating in Tomsk, however, doesn't really bode all that well for the state, nor that it is a revival of the Russian Republic. The Russian Republic itself, which was born after the 1917 revolution, was largely a dysfunctional mess that didn't manage to keep any of its promises to its supporters, mostly due to its decision to stay in World War I and the requirements of war production. It was a republic where the former leaders of populist peasantry had to protect the landlords whose land they had promised to redistribute to their farmer constituents, where the Social Democrats had to sacrifice the urban proletariat for the war machine of a state indebted to British and French capital. So it is not a happy legacy, that of the Russian Republic. These leaders later would end up joining with the monarchist and reactionary forces that they had previously fought, denounced, and overthrown from the 19th century all the way to February 1917. Actually all the way to August 1917 with the Kornilov coup, the Kornilov affair, joining with these forces to fight the Bolshevik menace or whatever during the Civil War. So yeah, that's the legacy that these guys have to face. There are two main political factions. One of them is the centrist modernists, probably the conservatives, and the Horseshoe Party, as I will call it, which are the Novgorodians, the ND, as you can see, Novgorodskoye Движение. Novgorodian movement. The Novgorodians take their name from the ancient Russian city-state of Novgorod, which is right over here, called Holmgard here. But as you can see, actually, it's in the territory of Pskov, which is kind of weird. This city is quite important in Russian history. It was its government was a strange blend of principality and merchant republic, a city ruled by dual power, one of them being a prince that could be invited or dismissed depending on the political climate, by a collection of republican institutions, the most important of which was the Vyetchia, the public assembly, which synthesized the interest of various landlord families and merchant groups. Novgorod is a controversial subject among scholars, with some considering the Novgorod Republic as a manifestation of a potentially more free and democratic spirit of Russia, while others highlight the oligarchic and centralizing nature of the state, which is much in common with its historic rival, Moscow. Among the earlier categories, so people who see Novgorod's legacy as positive, is a very, very influential 19th century historian and thinker called Alexander Herzen, who is considered one of the fathers of Russian revolutionary socialism and revolutionary populism. Who lamented that Moscow's victory over Novgorod in the struggle to unite Russia in the 15th century smothered all that was free in Russian life. The Novgorodian party is accordingly and confusingly split into two wings, one of them Libertarian Socialists and the other Authoritarian Democratic. So to speculate why, it might be that the right-wing Novgorodians might be a more traditionalist movement, or they might seek to revive aspects of the Novgorodian oligarchy, while the libertarian wing of the party, the left wing of the party, is likely composed of radical populists who are holding up Novgorod as a symbol of republican liberty against authoritarianism, and they cooperate with the right wing only in expedience of a united front against the ruling party, or because of nationalism, or something like that. It does seem likely, however, that both of these factions will try to emphasize Russia's republican past rather than Western models of democracy, while perhaps the more centrist, modernist faction will be trying to westernize aspects of Russia. South, we have another state that is very, very much rooted in Russia's history and Russia's ideological history, which is Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk is pretty much the capital of Siberia, and today is Russia's third largest city. But unlike many of Russia's other major centers, it is a relatively young settlement, with a population only numbering in the tens of thousands by the time of the revolution, and only saw its major growth after the 5-year plans and the accommodation of various waves of war refugees from especially World War II. All this matters little in the TNO timeline, however, as the state of Novosibirsk is no mere city government, but it is a theocracy, led by a relatively unknown but very important splinter branch of the Orthodox Church, known as the Old Believer Church. To understand the origins of this very obscure group, and the schism that caused it to split with mainstream Orthodoxy, we must go back to the 17th century, so quite far away. The 17th century for the Russian Empire was a period of reform and centralization, and backlash to it. It is hard to find a decade of the century which is not marked by rebellion and unrest of peasants, or Cossacks, or townspeople, or strenghts, who were the professional military corps of the Tsars. The Ulazhenie law code of 1649 first legalized serfdom, and in the first 2 years of his mandate between 1652 and 1654, the leader of the Orthodox Church, Patriarch Nikon, decreed changes to the ritual of the Russian Orthodox Church, such as how you make the sign of the cross and other things. These reforms were influenced by Greek and Ukrainian scholars. He was opposed by many of the clergy. In a series of councils, Nikon first forced the acceptance of his reforms through, and condemnation of the priests who would not submit, mainly led by the archpriest Avakum. Avakum and his colleagues rejected all compromise, and eventually the old practices and texts were proclaimed heretical, and those refusing to obey the council were anathematized, aka the Russian Orthodox version of excommunication. Avakum and his companions, after many tribulations, including exile to Siberia, and an attempt to return to Moscow, only to, again, refuse all compromise with reformers, and being imprisoned, and then exiled to a monastery in the far north of Russia near a place called Pustozirsk, were eventually all burned at the stake, executed. Even though before his death, Avakum was actually able to leave an account of his life to be written by one of the monks that would become quite important for Russian literature, because it is the first example of Russian vernacular use in literature, but that's another point. A very significant number of Russians, however, embraced the resulting schism in the church. They stuck with the old traditional ways. The church, the schism was immediately called Raskol from the start. And you may recognize this name if you read a bit of Russian literature, because a character of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, well, the main character, Raskolnikov, is actually named after this. His name is supposed to imply that he's a kind of rebel, because he's a schismatic. The Raskol was most widespread actually in areas where the power of the central government was less present. and as many as 20% of Russians became old believers. That's where the name comes from, because they believe in the old practices. So they were mostly in northern Russia, beyond the Urals, in Siberia, Cossack lands in the south, all that kind of stuff. Old believers were brutally persecuted from the beginning of the schism until the middle of the 19th century. This was in part because the Raskol began in a century of profound social upheaval and tension. So, like all heterodox or schismatic movements, the Raskol eventually had a political meaning as well. However, it developed its own language and ideology, and it expressed it within religion. So this expression is different from what we would kind of see today, but it also has a social content to it. The old believers in this regard were in some parts like English levelers or the followers of Thomas Müntzer in Germany, and in that they used the religious vocabulary to express their social and economic grievances, coupling that with a traditionalist religious ideology. The Raskol eventually splintered away into dozens of sects, separated by essentially the finest and pettiest theological distinctions, which also incidentally kind of separated parts of the ideological inspirations for the movement. So some people were more, socially inclined, while others were more religiously inclined. Many believe that with the fall of the true church in Russia, the reign of the Antichrist had begun, because Russia was the last bastion of true Christianity after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, and that they were now living in the end times. When they came into conflict with the forces of the state, their most militant response tended to actually be self-immolation for these early priests. Their apocalyptic expectations could not, however, last interminably, because the world did not end, and so the old believers began to adapt their beliefs to the prospect of a more permanent existence on Earth. This adaptation split the old believer movement into two main branches: the priestly movement, the popovtsi, the ones with priests, and the biespopovtsi, the priestless, who believed that since none of the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, who were the only ones that could make priests in the way that the Orthodox Church is sort of structured, none of them eventually, none of them ended up joining the schism. Because of that, there could not be any priests anymore, and it's kind of very, very complicated. And currently, there are 9 functioning Old Believer converts. The largest are the priestly concords. So, the priestless parts of the Old Believer movement are really the more fringe, and they're kind of like the Russian Amish. Believers were thus actually treated as important agents of Russian capitalist development, because the priestly concords eventually ended up sort of having, you could say, a more liberal disposition, because they wanted obviously free expression, freedom of religion, all that kind of stuff, and they were generally involved in trade quite a lot. However, today in the 21st century, both cultural and economic liberalism is considered pretty much outright demonical by old belief. This is despite the fact that the pre-revolutionary Old Believers were thinkers and spokesmen that generally actively engaged in supporting constitutional democracy. So in that sense, they've been both compared to Calvinists and, much more reactionary movements. So once again, that kind of duplicitous, dualistic nature of this ideology. In fact, some of the more reactionary Old Believers started to develop different ideas about the encroachment of the New World upon the Old. In the 1920s and the 1930s, there was sort of the invasion of modernization into peasant life for Russia. Before the big industrialization period of that followed the establishment of the Soviet Union, Russian peasant life hadn't really changed all that much. Well, it had changed in the Stolypin reforms, but before then, in terms of like technology or anything like that, it was pretty much the same as it was in the Middle Ages, pretty much. Which that's at least for the more remote communities. And this sort of invasion of modernization into traditional life was accompanied by a fundamental breakdown of traditional worldviews. There were new and previously unseen household items, tools, transportation, communications, and sometimes when peasants heard a broadcast from a radio speaker, they would just make the sign of the cross and refuse to have anything to do with this demonic deception or whatever. And you can imagine, even if the radio can produce that effect, then, you know, imagine an airplane. It would be like kind of an iron devil, or, you know, they would be afraid of agricultural machinery, believing that it would just trample the earth and destroy nature. And according to the more peasant strands of old belief, you know, the more radical strands, the emergence of railway networks, telephone, telegraph, the power plants, airplanes, and other technological advances, and in recent years television and the internet, are sort of the signs that are heralding the final battle of the apocalypse or whatever. So these people can be very, very extreme. That's what I'm trying to say. The situation in TNO is that basically the Novosibirsk, one of the biggest cities in Russia, has been taken over by these guys. Of course, the more priestly branch, as they do have an archbishop, as you can see. I'm not sure where they found a bishop to make a bishop, but I guess, you know, I guess they found a way or something. And the aging Metropolitan Flavian, who is the leader of the Old Believers, he finds himself in a difficult situation, leading a city in which his faction is a minority in, a faction that is, of course, has these big splits within it. While he is a representative, obviously, of a moderate wing of Old Belief, his Council of Old Practitioners, which is what this name means, Old Practitioners, it's just another way of saying Old Believers. Old Believers would be Starovieri, while this is Starobriatsyev. They rule as authoritarian Democrats. However, the city has two more factions, as you can see. There are the Christian Socialists, which seek to syncretize the teachings of Marx with the teachings of Christ in a kind of Russian liberation theology, which was an in real life ideology that tried to combine, again, Christian beliefs with sort of, you know, socialist tendencies, especially prominent in Latin America. And there's another one, more reactionary, the Движение Крестоносцев, the Christ-bearer movement, cross-bearer movement, which is a despotist group that probably seeks to, like, purge Holy Russia of its sinful ways or something, to wash it clean of the Antichrist Nikon's heretical influence or something like that. So yeah, that's the Old Believers. Moving east, we have some more old-rooted people with new outlooks on things. Kemerovo. Kemerovo is a imperial restorationist state led by the esteemed supreme ruler, autocrat, and emperor of the Rus, Rurik II, formerly Nikolai Ivanovich Krylov, a former Soviet army general who had essentially a mental breakdown after the Second World War, and he is addicted to drugs, alcohol, reads esoteric books and stuff like that. And so this explosive combination leads to an epiphany of sorts. What he wants to do, what he has realized that must be done for Russia, is to create a military, absolute, atheistic monarchy in Russia, which revives the legacy of the ancient state of the Kievan Rus, which was mostly encompassing this area, and united the Eastern Slavs briefly, and the legacy of its legendary Viking founder, Prince Rurik. That's why he's called Rurik II. Most of his neighbors only see a madman, so probably he won't have that much in terms of collaboration. He will have to conquer everything. But the mercenaries that follow him are attracted by his charisma and the promise of conquest, while the officers of his 62nd Army, which in real life actually fought the Battle of Stalingrad, and in this TNO timeline fought the Battle of Varshilovgrad, now called Paulusburg, are supportive of his eclectic mix of Soviet militarism and Russian traditionalism without the perceived weakness and degeneracy of the Romanov and Orthodox tradition. So they will definitely be fun to play indeed. Moving south, we have just a great state, Altai. The Altai, you can imagine that they're related to the state because they have the same name, are Turkic nomadic people that live in the mountains at the border between China, Mongolia, and Russia, so in the sort of crossroads of sorts. They are an obscure ethnicity, in fact, kind of so obscure that Russians and Chinese mistook them for Mongol Oirats for like centuries, when in fact they are a Turkic ethnic group. They are more closely related, for example, to the Tuvans, right to the east, or to the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs of Xinjiang than to the Mongols. And the Oirats in real life actually were genocided by the Chinese, but that's just very, very, big sort of sidetrack that I'm not going to get into. Now, the leader of the state is Lazar Kokishev, who is a novelist turned fascist dictator, just the usual stuff, who wishes to conquer living space for the Altai and carve out new states for other minorities like the Tuvans and the Yakuts to be his feudal tributaries. There is, however, a reformist democratic party that is opposing him and would likely be more, reasonable. So it kind of looks like they are trying to do a bit like what Tatarstan is doing in the Urals and Western Russia, trying to unite various different ethnicities to get self-determination. Then, moving north, we have another sort of ethnic, but, mostly Russian state that is trying to do a very, very unique thing, which is Khakassia, or Khakassia. Khakassia is another ethnic region of Russia, inhabited originally by a people called the Khakas, unsurprisingly. This is represented by Tuvan culture in the game. However, this is wrong, because by the 1930s, the Khakas were by far a minority compared to the Russian population, so it must be some kind of weird alternate timeline nonsense. The government is mostly made up of dissidents from the Russo-Tuvan Mongolian weird entity called Svobodny Organ that we're not going to cover in this video, but worth to remember that these guys exist, that used to control a bigger area around here under, the Red Army, under Alexander Vasilievsky, and is actually an anarcho-communist federation. As you can see, they're Libertarian Socialists, much like Orthodox, actually, of TNO Old World Blues fame. However, apparently, I'm not sure if this is because they haven't added any national spirits yet, or because they'll actually be like this in the full game. They don't seem to have, some of the dysfunctionalities of Orthodox. And actually, Mother Anarchy watches over its children in this isolated territory enough that, unlike Orthodox, Khakassia can actually embark on a path of liberation that would eventually, if successful, which probably almost never will be, but you can try, would result in a Makhnovist-esque Russia, which would truly be amazing. Now, in case you haven't watched my other video and not know how this works, this system is very, very much based upon the sort of communal federation called the Free Territory of Ukraine that in real life was extinguished during the Russian Civil War, but that had a sort of very lasting legacy, which was kind of, again, an anarchist rural federation of, communes that sort of self-organized and is overall quite amazing. So yeah, pretty cool. Also, some people try to do it in China and Manchuria, which is kind of hilarious, but whatever. So yeah, that's Khakassia. East of that, we have a very different state called Krasnoyarsk. Krasnoyarsk is one of the main centers of the Trans-Siberian Railway along the Yenisei River. Pretty important. As you can see, it's kind of long. As an economic center, it is important in electricity and aluminum production, but we don't really know anything about what it's going to do in TNO. So yeah, all we know is that they are ruled by by a guy that in real life was a poet, actually of the Khakas ethnicity. So yeah, called Mikhail Kilchichakov, who only cares for expanding his wealth and power as a bandit. So yeah, that's all we know. To the east as well, Ust-Yimsk is another pretty, bland, because we don't know anything about it, territory, led by Nikolai Andreev, who was a real-life Soviet general. And they're just an anonymous town on the Angar River, and home to logging and papermaking industries. So yeah, that's them. Then we get to a more developed region, more interesting, to the southeast with Irkutsk. Irkutsk is Eastern Siberia's most important center, before, of course, the Trans-Siberian Railway heads into the serious far east of Russia. Because of its importance, due to being the transportation hub, linking central Siberia to the Russian Far East, it was fought over fiercely during the Russian Civil War, and was briefly the capital of the Supreme Ruler Kolchak's government, of Kaiserreich fame from Trans-Amur. After the war, the economy specialized in manufacturing goods such as aircraft and machine tools, and in fact, the Irkutsk aviation factory mainly produced bombers for the USSR Air Force, so it is quite an important manufacturing center. The leader of Irkutsk, unfortunately for the population, is a man named Yerich Yagada. Yagada is a man of relatively mysterious origins from among Russia's Jewish population, but it is certain that after the 1917 revolution, he joined the CHK, the institutional predecessor to the NKVD, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. Yagada appeared to have supported Bukharin's views on economic issues, but then betrayed him in real life for Stalin's support. In the words of Bukharin's widow, actually, Anna Larina, Yagada traded his personal views for the sake of his career and degenerated into a criminal and miserable coward. So, yeah, understandably not exactly happy, considering that Bukharin would eventually be executed by Stalin, so understandable. His reward would be ever-increasing positions and internal security. He became the head of the intelligence service, the OGPU, and in 1934, he became the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, the head of the NKVD. Under his guidance, the first Moscow show trials were organized, during which the revolutionary leaders Kamenev and Zinoviev were falsely accused and murdered, assassinated, executed. Despite this, Stalin would eventually replace him as head of internal security with another man called Yezhov and purge him in 1937. According to the, dubious historian Simon Montefiore, Yagada's two Moscow apartments and his dacha contained 3,904 pornographic photos when they were searched by policemen after he was arrested. Also, 11 pornographic films, 165 pornographically carved pipes, which I'm not sure what that's supposed to even mean. Did they just, have, I don't know, naked girls on the woodwork? I don't know, I don't understand. And a dildo, and also the 2 bullets that killed Kamenev and Zinoviev. So, what a great man. Now, I'm not 100% sure on the source, but whatever. It is funny, so I put it in. Yagada was tried guilty of various charges and shot. Funnily enough, the charges themselves against Yagada were pretty much invented, even though there were plenty of wrong to, trial him for. He was also, he was not alone, actually, in being executed. It was part of the bigger wave of purging, the Great Purge. And in fact, his sister and his brother-in-law were also executed along with him. Yagada was pretty much the epitome of Stalinist mediocrity, we could say. His career was built entirely on lies, deceit, intrigue, and the actions that he embarked upon made the Soviet state weaker, but also prepared the way for his much more terrifying successor, first Yezhov, and after he was purged as well, Lavrenti Beria, who is probably the best-known purger and head of the NKVD of the group. He would survive, of course, until the death of Stalin in 1953, and then be executed himself. In the TNO timeline, presumably Yagada was never embroiled in any show trials, as Stalin never came to power, and he became a protege of Nikolai Bukharin. However, he had much influence in the Kremlin, and now he leads a remnant of the KPSS, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in Irkutsk, after formerly being the leader of the People's Republic of the Far East, a larger successor state to the Soviet Union. However, much like Tyumen, under Kaganovich, he lost most of his former lands to what he deems traitors and opportunists and all that kind of stuff. Mostly Buryatia, Altan, Yakutsk, all these people, Ust-Ilimsk. And he is now convinced that only his NKVD apparatus, his security units, are loyal enough to run the Soviet Union and continue his reign of terror. So who knows? Who knows if Magnitogorsk goes NKVD and goes with the wrong NKVD path? What kind of nonsense these two can get together and cook up. The majority culture of the state is Buryats, which is definitely wrong because Irkutsk was a majority Russian city, but Buryats brings us to the next state, and a very, very interesting one, Buryatia. As we mentioned earlier, Yagada has made enemies of his former allies who felt the boot of his oppression, and one such territory is Buryatia, by far the biggest opposition to Yagada's rule of terror. Buryatia is led by a young commissar, Valery Sablin, who would actually be probably the youngest of all the leaders in TNO, as far as we know, but I don't have the date of his birth on the in my head, so I don't remember, but he's 20-something right now. And he was once part of the government of the People's Republic of the Far East as a commissar in the army, in the NKVD. The government of the Buryat Autonomous Socialist Republic, formerly ruled by, again, General Yagada, was overthrown by Sablin with support from the people of Buryatia and the army. Sablin aspires to build a libertarian socialist society, holding the banner of the October Revolution as an inspiration, a light of hope in a world of despots. However, Sablin's inexperience with leadership will soon threaten to end his idealistic experiments, and one can only hope that Buryatia can endure and survive under his leadership. Now, the particularity of the TNO timeline allows Sablin much more room to enact his revolutionary vision than our timeline. I may be asking, what did he do in our timeline? He, in our timeline, attended the Frunze Naval Institute and served in the Soviet fleet since the 1960s. After excelling in his duties and enrolling in the Lenin Military Political Academy, which trained political officers, he was stationed as an officer to the state-of-the-art anti-submarine frigate called Starozhivoy. And, because of his thorough training and his success, he had, a promising career. However, he, throughout the years, had noticed that the ideology of the USSR and the political practice of the country were miles apart. He saw the corruption, the political repression, both at home and abroad in the Khrushchev era, which continued only with more conservatism and stagnation in the Brezhnev era. To him, these were failures of a corrupt system that had betrayed, however, the correct socialist roots and commitment to Soviet power of the revolution. What he did next was actually pretty much nothing short of extraordinary. At the opportune moment, with the ship sailing out of the Gulf of Riga, he arrested some of the commanders of the ship and convinced some of the officers and the rest of the crew to join him on a nearly suicidal mission to spark a second great socialist revolution. The plan was to sail to Kronstadt, which is an island right in the middle of the Baltic. Well, not right in the middle of the Baltic, just outside of St. Petersburg or Leningrad or whatever you want to call it. And then to Leningrad itself, reliving the voyage of the cruiser Aurora and docking next to it, while broadcasting on radio and television an appeal to the Russian people, an appeal to rise up against bureaucratism and restore socialism in a second-rate Russian revolution. The plan obviously failed. You all know the story of what happened to the Soviet Union in the end, so never a revival happened. And Sablin and his comrades were arrested, Sablin himself was executed, and this incident, which was sort of picked up, obviously, by Sweden and the West in the Cold War climate of the period, was presented to the world and to the Soviet people as a plan of a would-be defector who wanted to run away to Sweden, to the West, and not for the revolutionary attempt, very, very far-fetched, but attempt it was, that it actually, was intended to be. Now, this story, in case it sounds kind of familiar, it's because the story that kind of leaked out, again, the story of a defector, would end up inspiring a very, very famous novel and a very, very famous movie, none other than The Hunt for Red October. So yeah, that's the background for Sablin and Buryatia, and why I would definitely be very, 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 very looking forward to playing this area. Then we have to the east a bunch of pretty much, you could say, bread and butter warlord states with some interesting spice thrown into it. So let's go east to Aldan. Aldan is pretty much just some random mining town in Yakutia. I believe they mine gold, which is one of the most remote regions of Russia. As you can see, it's very, 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 very far apart from most major centers. What's more interesting, however, is the story of its warlord, Burjab Ochirov. He served in pretty much every conflict of the Soviet Union after the Civil War. Starting from the very obscure battles for the Chinese Eastern Railway, fought between the Red Army and the Manchurian warlord Zhang Xueliang, and his White Russian mercenaries that supported him, making a final stand against the Red Army. Ochirov would go on serving with the Buryat and Mongol cavalry of the Red Army against the Japanese at the bitter battles of Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol, in the Winter War against the Finns, and in the Great Patriotic War, where his unit was encircled in the Smolensk pocket at the beginning of the war. And this forced Ochirov and his comrades to become guerrillas. Ochirov became the leader of a partisan group, and eventually, once the advancing Red Army reunited with many partisan formations, including his own, he rejoined the army and fought all the way to Berlin. So he definitely had a very, very interesting life. Probably going to be a very, very standard warlord state, however, in TNO. Just a very interesting background story. To the south, we have another warlord, but a very, very different one, Chita. Wasn't there a Tsar already? Where is he? Now, why is this? The Russian emigres... the Russian emigres had an anti-Soviet movement. Now, after the Russian Revolution, a bunch of people from Russia fled overseas, most to Germany, France, Manchuria, and the United States. Some to Turkey, some to Greece, some to Bulgaria. And they tried to, plot ways to return to Russia and destroy the Soviet Union. Sometimes not. This movement, however, was always plagued by factionalism and rivalry. Some of the emigres we have already seen, actually, in the form of the pro-Soviet Eurasianists, the Smirnovyhovtsi, and the Mladarossi, the Young Russians, and Berezniki. These were new movements, born out of the emigration, whose ideology and structure were entirely based upon the, at the time, present circumstances that these communities were facing. Many other ideological groups would merge, and we're going to see some more of these represented later in the video, cough cough. But the majority of the early immigrants were initially supporters of the three major political forces in pre-revolutionary Russia. There were the liberals, belonging to the Constitutional Democratic Party, or Kadets, Konstitutionno-Demokraticheskaya Partia Kadeti, whose descendants, rather, are in Tomsk, most likely, along with the heirs of the agrarian populace. We've seen the left-wing Novgorodians most likely are the heirs of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, also called Eseri, or SRs. which are also empowering Kaiserreich in case you, at the beginning of Kaiserreich in Russia, in case you want another reference. And lastly, but not leastly, the third major ideological movement, third major, political force, were the monarchists. Now, most immigrants were part of the extremely reactionary White Army, or the upper classes of some form, and were in some form monarchist because of this. However, the monarchist movement was by far the most fractured. In fact, many cadets, many liberals had been constitutional monarchists. Then there were the crypto-fascist young Russians, the Mladarossi, who supported a monarchy that incorporated the Soviet social economy and the political system of the Soviet Union into a monarchy. Even those who supported sort of straight, old-fashioned Tsarist autocracy, or samoderzhavie, as it had been practiced in Russia for sort of hundreds of years, had to deal with the fact that the Romanov imperial family did not really offer suitable claimants anymore for the throne. This was, really the entire reason that the Bolsheviks had killed Nicholas II with his children, some of them pretty young, to remove any sort of chance of these people ever coming to sort of be rallying figures under which the monarchist movement could make a bid for, a restoration. Only cousins and nephews of the last Tsar remained. And these people were not really considered by succession law or succession practice because the circumstance had never come up for the Russian imperial family. Now, a divide emerged in the monarchist movement between the supporters of we could call him the Phantom Tsar Kirill Vladimirovich, who entertained contact with the young Russians, the Mladarossi, and in fact also the German Nazis in the 20s and the 30s, who tried twice, actually, to revive a Russian government in exile, the first time in Coburg in Germany, from an estate, and later St. Briac in Brittany, on the coast of the Atlantic, sort of trying to set up this weird shadow Russian government that's really, really interesting if you read into it. Links to sources down in the description, or, names of sources down in the description if you can get a hold of some of these books. There's stuff on the guy, and it's kind of funny, kind of interesting, very. And the second faction were the more numerous supporters of a guy called Nikolai Nikolaevich, who was the Grand Duke that had been the commander-in-chief of the Russian army during the disastrous early months of the Great War, who included the organization that attempted to continue the legacy of the Russian army called the ROVS, the Российский общевоенный Soyuz, or the All-Russian Military Union. So these were the remnants of the White Army. Most of them were from the sort of southern Russian White Army under especially Pyotr Wrangel, again an important character in Kaiserreich, who had escaped to eastern sort of the Balkans from Crimea, but who had also a branch in the Far East. The son of Kirill Vladimirovich, the first pretender, actually rules in Vyatka, Vladimir Kirillovich. And he sort of kept up entertaining contacts with weird political groups and stuff like that. And he rules in Vyatka as Vladimir I. The other Tsarist faction seemed to have thrown its weight behind another pretender called Mikhail Andreevich, this sort of the son of another cousin of Nicholas II. So he's like kind of a grandnephew, I think, of Nicholas II. And he is a Romanov prince that actually served in Australia with the British Navy during World War II, which is kind of weird because that means he would have fought against the Japanese. And now he is leading a very probably pro-Japanese warlord, pretender, imperial Russian state in Chita. The supporters of this restoration, in fact, were likely drawn from the immigrant white monarchist community in Manchuria, which at first flourished under the Manchurian Fengtian warlord clique of Chinese fashion, and later under Manchukuo, which was the Japanese puppet state and it still is in the TNO timeline. which consisted mainly of the remnants of the Cossack armies of Ataman Grigory Semyonov and the Russo-Mongolian army of the Baltic German warlord Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, again of Kaiserreich fame, and a third Russian army called the Zemskaya Rat, or the parliamentarian host, let's just translate it as, which was led by the Tsar's general called Mikhail Dieterichs, or Dieterichs. Dieterichs, who has a really fucking annoying name, became the head of the Far East chapter of the ROVS, so the sort of militarist organization of post-Soviet Russia in the 1920s. We've already seen how some of these White Russian troops continue to operate in the Far East, especially in Manchuria during the Chinese Warlord era, many times as mercenaries to, some of the more flamboyant warlords, such as, again, Zhang Zuolin or Zhang Zongchang, all these kind of people. This force in TNO seems to have thrown its weight behind the pretender Mikhail II, again, Mikhail Andreevich, who is, however, controlled by unknown White Army generals. So the difference between Chita and Vyatka is that, one, they are part of two different sort of cadet branches of the Romanov family, or not really cadet, but two different branches of the Romanov family, so the two different sort of pretenders, two different legitimists, and also they have two different sources of support. Vladimir has a more political background with like weird-ass European right-wing movements, supported by Germans, Russian fascists, all that kind of stuff. While the Eastern imperial restorationists are remnants of the White armies, so very, very ultra-reactionary, but not exactly, not exactly mingling with the rabble that is the Germans. They're more aristocratic, they're more old-fashioned, you could say, and they are more linked with the Japanese instead. Now, these White Army generals, some of them, now you can say 1962, damn, it's a long time since like the Russian Civil War, but like some of the White Army leaders could be still alive by this point, actually. Some of the participants of the White movement, in fact, in real life died in like the 1990s. Even in the 2000s, some of the extremely long-lived ones. And a couple of candidates that I've looked up that could be possible generals for Chita are the Ussuri Cossack. The Ussuri is sort of this river that runs at the border between Russia and China. Ussuri Cossack, known as Pavel Biermont Avalov, who in real life was a German proxy in the Baltic during the Russian Civil War and ended up moving to the United States. He might decide to move back to his homeland or something to support the last Romanov or something like that. And another candidate that's in fact very plausible is Ataman Semyonov himself. Now, Grigory Semyonov had led the Cossack forces and later the entire White Army in the far eastern region during the Russian Civil War. In real life, he retreated to Manchuria with some of his forces, some of his Cossacks, and eventually settled down in Dairen, or Dalian Port, or Port Arthur, or whatever the fuck you want to call this place because it's got so many names. And he ended up being captured and executed by the Red Army when they invaded Manchuria in 1945. However, since this has never happened in the TNO timeline, it's possible that we can see this sort of White movement celebrity in the TNO timeline, because it's entirely possible that he's alive. He would be 71 by 1st of January 1962. So, yeah, could be there. Whether the, autocrat can become an actual autocrat and sort of free himself from the influence of his generals, or if this is going to be a White Army military junta, it remains to be seen. North, we have another warlord state, which is Irkutsk. Irkutsk is the capital of the ethnic republic of Sakha, or Sakha, not sure where the emphasis is on that word, also called Yakutia, very blandly and perhaps more simply. In the modern Russian Federation, this is one of the ethnic republics, and it is one of the coldest and most remote cities on the planet, Irkutsk. In fact, I believe it's the second coldest place with more than 100,000 inhabitants in the world, after another city called Norilsk, which I'm not sure if it exists in the TNO timeline, but yeah. And in the USSR, it was the capital of the Yakut ASSR, the Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic of the Yakuts. And its legacy is continued in TNO timeline by the warlord Valentin Pavlov, who worked for the Interior Ministry Police of Yakutia during the war, so they're pretty standard. South, we see someone who is, well, more eccentric and probably more interesting. Amur. Amur is another warlord, which is a faction that emerges out of the Russian immigration. Now, after the unholy union forced the true sons of Russia out, some of them found their way to Manchuria, as we saw, to Harbin, called Xinjiang in Manchukuo, or New Capital. But it's this city over here, where under the leadership of a man called Radzaevsky, as you can see, they adopted the ideology of fascism in order to more effectively fight the Bolshevism. In the face of fascism, the unholy union was shattered in TNO timeline. Of course, the Germans destroyed them, and they believe that it is beneath the banner of fascism that the homeland will be reborn. For now, though, they are confined to the Far East, to sort of an isolated area, and they have to face very difficult challenges around here. Now, who were the Russian fascists in real life? They never numbered more than 10,000, so not that many. However, most of them were immigrants, including Tsarist army officers, Cossacks, priests, academics, disgruntled bourgeoisie, sometimes seasoned with fake aristocrats, pre-adolescent Romanovs, prisoners, and, you know, the usual sprinkling of Soviet double agents. They collaborated with Chinese warlords, Japanese generals, the Nazis, and, you know, even like the Connecticut State Police, which is kind of hilarious. But that's a different branch from the one that we are examining. The sad fact is that behind the world of illusions that the Russian fascists built for themselves in real life, they were simply patriots who did not know of any way of serving their motherland other than allying with its enemies, the Japanese, becoming traitors, targets, and stooges. Their origin lies in the wave of exile from Russia that followed the October Revolution, as we know, when hundreds of thousands fled Russia to begin a new life of exile. For the vast majority of immigrants, exile actually meant a loss of status, a plunge into the very real world of economic dependence and employment. However, most aristocrats and intellectuals still lived a sort of comfortable material life, so they were used to it. Spiritually, however, the shame of having to be protected by foreigners, alien states, many of whom had been previously enemies of Russia, such as Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, sort of was very, very, you know, discomforting for this sort of their psyche. And the vain hope of the inevitable collapse of the Soviet regime never materialized. So this, again, as we saw, some to escape this led sort of old-fashioned organizations meant to conserve what was there, such as the ROVS, the Russian All-Military Union, while some others began to rethink the role of Soviet Russia, such as, you know, as we saw, the Eurasianists and the Mladorossi. Some others just kind of elapsed into delusion, denialism, depression. However, many ex-officers, politicians, former landowners, and intellectuals formed Russian chauvinist groups. So out of pre-existing groups, such as the Union of Russian People, which has actually existed in Tsarist times, which was best known for their military wing, the Black Hundreds, and they were actually an important political force in the chaos of 1917. Many blamed Jews and Asiatics for the, revolution, for the fall of their civilization, as they put it. Through the Baltic German element of the migration, many nobles in the Russian Empire were of Baltic German origin. They formed links with the German extreme right, National Socialism. Among them was future Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg. So some of these Baltic Germans actually just, straight up joined the Nazis. Others were attracted to fascism as a dynamic antidote to Bolshevism, seeing monarchism as a venerable but impotent ideal. Many emigrants had escaped both the Red Army and the infamous Siberian White Army leaders Semyonov and Sternberg into China. Now, while the White Army was retreating, many of the more undisciplined White Army troops actually, were pretty much robbing and killing pretty much everyone who ran away, no matter if supporting the Whites or the Reds. Them and the remnants of these retreating White armies found themselves employed by either the international authorities in Shanghai or Chinese warlords such as the ones in Manchuria, like Zhang Zuoling. It is indeed in Manchuria that the majority of the exiles found themselves from the east, including, as we already saw, Semyonov, who settled in Dairen, and also many former troopers. Many were actually alarmed at the collaboration between Chinese nationalists and the Soviet Union, and they thought that, this collaboration would eventually lead to the Sovietization of China and the end of any hope of, returning to Russia. So they began to look to Japan for aid and collaboration. Mixing anti-Semitism and anti-Bolshevism with Russian nationalism and Japanese patronage, Russian fascism sort of was birthed and grew in Manchuria in the 30s under the Russian equivalent of Duce Mussolini or Führer Hitler, who is Vazd Radzaevsky. In 1931, under the leadership of this, at the time, student, the Russian Fascist Party was founded, with the stated aim to create a Christian and corporatist Russia. Beginning with only a group of around 200 students, the Japanese seizure of Manchuria in the same year, 1931, provided an opportunity for the group to grow under the patronage of Japan as a proxy, as an anti-communist proxy. The party acted like thugs and mafia for the competing Japanese intelligence services. The Tokumu Kikan, responsible for the Imperial General Army, to the Imperial Army General Staff in Tokyo, so representatives of the central government, and the Kempeitai, the military gendarmerie, which in Manchuria were accountable to the commander of the Continental Guangdong Army, or Kwantung Army, or whatever you want to call it. So a faction that often, while technically part of the Japanese army, acted very independently. Very, very interesting stuff that we can't get into right now. So the political climate of this area was extremely volatile and open to all sorts of weird shit to come up, to summarize. Despite, this perhaps promising beginning, the organization was pretty much unable to achieve any successes in infiltrating the USSR, and was destroyed following the Red Army's invasion of Manchuria in August 1945. Radzaevsky and other leaders, including Semyonov, as we already saw, were subsequently executed for treason. In TNO, however, the Axis victory has allowed the RFP to set up a government in the remote town of Zeya in Russia's Amur Oblast. There is also a rival Russian Fascist Party government in neighboring Magadan under Party Supreme Councillor Yev Akhotyan. The substance of this rivalry is actually pretty much clear. We're not sure what the hell these people are arguing over. Probably just the leadership of the overall fascist movement, and probably also having to deal with, I hope, because it would be cool, different attitudes to collaboration with Japan and the differing Japanese agencies and entities and actors that are going to be supporting maybe one or the other. Who knows? Now, you may notice that the border in TNO between Russia and Japan is actually far different than in our timeline. The Japanese have taken over the port of Vladivostok, which they call Kaisani, probably coming from the Chinese name for it, although I have no idea what the Chinese call Vladivostok, and which is annexed to the greater Japanese empire, much like the disputed islands of Sakhalin or Karafuto and the Kurils or Shishimaretto, whatever the hell those are, and also large swathes of the Russian Far East have been annexed to the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. These lands actually were traditionally belonged to Jurchen and Manchurian tribes, and they were known as Outer Manchuria. These lands were inherited into China following the establishment of the Manchu Qing dynasty in the 17th century, but they were subsequently lost by China during the collapse of the empire during the 19th century Taiping Rebellion, which started in the south but eventually grew around the area of Nanjing, which is a very, very complicated ordeal that we're not going to get into. Through very complicated international diplomacy and politics, which intermingled with this veritable Chinese civil war in the 1850s and 60s, China starts to crumble, fall apart, and lose a bunch of territory and concessions to Western powers, among whom Russia, which, however, was a continental rather than a sea power. So while the British take over things like Hong Kong, and the Japanese take Taiwan, and eventually, and various concessions are carved out in Shanghai, in French areas in Indochina, and the south of China. The Russians want territory. Now, during the Taiping Rebellion, because of the Qing armies being busy again in the central parts of China and the north being undefended, the Russians are able to, in the Treaty of Aigun, annex what would become the Amur Oblast, which is this area, up to the Amur River, which is this one. And 2 years later, in 1860, in a major, masterful diplomatic coup, the Russian Governor-General of the Far East, Nikolai Muravyov, managed to get into the negotiations following the what was known as the Arrow War, or the Second Opium War, which ended with British and French troops landing in Tianjin, past the Dagu forts, and entering Beijing and burning the famous Beijing Imperial Summer Palace. And the Russians, despite not being part of this coalition against the Qing Empire, despite not having fired a single shot, despite having only offered vague promises of support to the dynasty in suppressing their domestic rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, Russia managed to also nab another major territory on top of the hundreds of thousands of square kilometers that they've already taken without firing a single shot in the Treaty of Aigun in the Convention of Beijing, which would eventually become the Maritime Province, or Primorye in Russian, and eventually founded the city of Vladivostok, which in Russian means the dominator of the East, the conqueror of the East. So, yeah, the message is pretty clear to everyone around here. Russia's here, and Russia's here to stay. Now, Russia's expansion into the Pacific threatened China's and Japan's strategic security in a way that no other European power could, as it aimed to seize Manchuria eventually and establish a warm water naval base in the Pacific in the form of Port Arthur, and perhaps even seize Korea. So it was a major threat to both the territorial integrity of China and of Japan, while the maritime Western powers were more interested in commercially exploiting these two major markets. So that's why eventually there was the major 1905 war between Russia and Japan, because by the time that the Russians were trying to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, they could have, with that, major implement expand their influence into Korea and eventually, you know, threaten Japan itself. It is no surprise then that the victorious Japan would have both motive and cause, because again, these used to be Chinese territory pretty much until the 1850s, the late 1850s, while they were very, very underpopulated, and you know, Russian settlement had already sort of tried to penetrate in there multiple times. In fact, the Manchus had already had to defend this area against the Russians in the 17th century, which they were actually successful at. You know, this used to be technically Manchu or Chinese territory, so it being annexed into Manchukuo does make a bit of historical sense. However, by now they are they're mostly Russified, as you can see, and Manchukuo government itself is pretty much already unable to control the countryside of their own heartland beneath or within the Hingan and Wanda mountain ranges, which are this one and this one, which separate inner Manchuria from outer Manchuria. And the Russification of the area means that the Manchurian government in Japan can award this area back to a Russian warlord that is, you know, willing to supply sufficient guarantees of, you know, services to the empire or whatever. So yeah, that's the end of Siberia. I hope that you've enjoyed. This was ridiculously long, as you probably have noticed, but hey, there was a lot to talk about. Hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you soon.